is in hybrid format. We're very happy that so many of you have turned up. We're getting back to business as usual, but we're also using the achievements or the changes occasioned by the pandemic, and we have listeners online. We have people joining us online. Welcome to everybody who's present in person, and welcome to those of you following this online. This is a very important meeting, which is organized by 4 organizations. Apart from the Batory foundations, there's the Club of Rome, the Open Societies Foundation, and Systemiq. And the reason we're here today, you've seen the title. The title of this session is a Great Crisis or Great Change, and starting out with a presentation of a very interesting report. It's a very complex title, and the content is also complex. It's the International System Change Compass, the global implications of achieving the European Green Deal. So we want to take that as a starting point to discuss how, not technically, because we can imagine how to achieve the European Green Deal, but how to carry out the European Green Deal so as to avoid tension, both internal and external. We know that the world is very complex, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. The theater of operations is local. Nonetheless, the whole world is involved to some extent, and also various issues that don't seem directly related to the war, the energy transition, climate change, and all of these issues. So the approach taken by the authors of the report seems indeed very crucial, and that's what we'll be talking about for us as a foundation. This is also an important moment. For the past 2 years, we've been addressing the issues of the European Green Deal and its consequences. The presentation of the report launches another season of our involvement. We hope to be inspired by the debate. We hope that the debate will set the destination or program the next 2 months. This will be a very intense meeting. It's 2 hours. In the first part, the authors of the report will present the main theses, premises. We'll have a presentation by Sandrine Dixson-Declève from the Club of Rome, then Heather Grabbe, the director of the Open Society Europe Policy Institute, will deliver a presentation, and then Janez Potočnik from Systemiq, an EU EC commissioner, also will present other aspects of this report, and then we'll move on to a discussion, a commentary by Marcin Korolec, the director of the Green Economy Institute, and then we'll invite our panelists, and I'll introduce the panelists in due time. So much by way of an introduction, and now let's have the first part, which is a video presentation by Sandrine Dixson-Declève, which we'll be watching on screen.
Dobry dzień, ladies and gentlemen. I'm terribly sorry that I cannot be with you at our International System Change Compass workshop in Poland. I'm here with the colleagues today to explain our incredible International Systems Change Compass, and in particular the linkages that are so important with the systems thinking that we have in the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome, after 50 years of focus on system dynamics, very clearly predicted through scenarios that actually we could be facing core tipping points if we did not actually adopt a systems change, not a linear way of thinking through wicked problems. The human problematique now is such that we are faced with the 3 Cs, climate, COVID, and conflict. The poly-crisis today shows even more how much we need to shift from linear thinking and linear acting to optimized systems thinking. And that is the essence of our compass. shifting to a way in which we think about circularity, that we shift actually from extractive economies into well-being economies, that we put in place the right systems change policies that enable us to move out of the extractive economy, to move out from our current financial system, and think through actually how we can service people, planet, and prosperity at this time of polycrisis. That calls for what Dana Meadows, the core author of The Limits to Growth, would ask for in terms of leverage points. Thinking through short-term levers for long-term systems change. Again, the essence of the 10 principles of our compass. To see how we can apply this to the incredible European Green Deal. Not only a philosophical standing now for the European Commission, a vision of the future, but also policy mechanisms that will enable us to be much more holistic in the way in which we do address the polycrisis. But we're not there yet. And what we've seen in the recommendations of the compass is that we need to move much more into the implementation phase now of the European Green Deal, so that Fit for 55 actually does become a reality. So how do we do that in terms of the compass thinking? Applying systems through a compass lens, ensuring that we also do not disconnect our impact and our relationships from the rest of the world. The European Green Deal gives us a starting point for environmental and social indicators. Through the compass, we put together very clear 10 principles that actually put in place that holistic thinking and move from economic systems change through the new types of economic actors that we actually need, all the way through into new leadership, trade, competition, partnerships, and way in which we actually embed our decision-making in terms of values. Value which is now placed on human life, on social indicators, as well as natural indicators. Applying that compass to the European Green Deal, we are convinced will enable Europe to not only be the leader globally, but also to truly encompass what it is today in the 21st century, to be a leader in terms of governance. But that also means that we need to think through the impact, in particular when we look at value chain disruption and the way in which we have so many unholy dependencies, not only in terms of our dependencies on certain products or supply chains, because we are so focused and much too much on supply rather than demand, but also our dependencies on certain trade partners, on certain partners, political partners in general. So if the European Green Deal is embedded in the compass and vice versa, we then can start to unpack what are those tensions in terms of our relationships with the rest of the world. What does that look like in terms of our trade deals? How can we become not only leaders in Europe, but also leaders globally by being good citizens as Europeans to the rest of the world? Guide the rest of the world in terms of the way in which we shift from an extractive economy into a new visionary economy of the future, one which takes into consideration people, planet, and prosperity at its core, one that understands that we must shift from an extractive economy to a well-being economy. So that is my message for you today. I know my colleagues will build on this message and demonstrate to you very clearly what it looks like to embed our compass work into a European Green Deal that is vibrant for Europe. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry once again that I can't be with you.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for this introduction. And now, Heather Grabbe. And now, before we invite Heather Grabbe to deliver her presentation, before we ask Janez Potočnik, let me just say that this meeting is being translated into English and Polish by our interpreters, and we also have sign language interpreters, Joanna and Elżbieta, who are translating this into Polish Sign Language. Janez.
And of course, thank you, Sandrine, we miss you. Dear friends, it's a great opportunity to be here with you. We will in next 20-25 minutes with Heather explain you the essence of the compass and also the essence of the International System Change Compass. But this will be more done by Heather. I will do more or less the introduction, which is based on something which it's my major occupation. And that occupation is that I chair the UNEP International Resource Panel, which is a kind of a sister organization to IPCC, which is dealing with the climate change, as you know, but we are dealing with the natural resource management. So we will give you the optic of natural resource management. So probably many of you have already seen that this is the Keith Raworth approach to how we should consider the safe operating space in which we are living. The inner part of the circle are basic human needs, which of course are expanding. And the outer part of the circle are planetary limits. What is pretty much unfortunate is that while the inner circle is expanding, the outer circle is, of course, given to us by the planetary limits. And we are already seeing that in some areas, we are surpassing those planetary limits. This is actually not the latest picture. The latest picture, it's worse, but it was published just a few weeks ago. That's why I will basically go through the original figures. So in the climate change, in the biodiversity loss, in land conservation, in nitrogen and phosphorus management, we are already out of the planetary limits. But it is interesting to look to that in a national context. If you look here, comparison from Malawi, China, Belgium, and Australia, you would find out that, of course, national situation in surpassing planetary boundaries, it's entirely different. But let me try to explain you in just 2 slides where in the most simplified way, where the major problems which we have to deal with lies. You know that we are measuring our success normally in GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the non-dotted gray line on the top, this one. So if you look to the period which is represented here, the GDP has basically doubled in that period. It's the period 92-2014. So that's when the study was done. But if you look to the Inclusive Wealth Index, which is a broader concept than GDP, it has 3 components. One is production capital, and production capital per capita, it's the gray dotted line. And this is a kind of a synonym for GDP. And it's growing practically in the same way. So it has doubled in that period. The blue dotted line, it's human capital per capita, which has increased in that period for approximately 8%, 8 percentage points. And if you look to the green one, which is natural capital per capita, it has in that period decreased for approximately 40%. So the conclusion that the growth in GDP in the past decades has been to a large extent based on the depletion of natural capital, it's not so difficult. And this leads me, since by profession I'm actually professor of economics, and this is very much simplified explanation of economy. So you know that we as producers and consumers behave rationally, at least our rational behavior in a short term stands. But unfortunately, this rational behavior in the short term, it's irrational from a long term. But so the most important thing which is leading us that we decide where to go, what to do, are of course the signals which we are receiving on the markets. And if I simplify from the picture which we have seen before, then production capital, it's overvalued and over-rewarded. Human capital, it's undervalued and under-rewarded. And natural capital, unfortunately, it's not valued at all. So if somebody believes that from that signals on the market we will get economic, social, and environmental balance, wake up. We will never get it, and this is the essence of the problem. But let me now turn to the bread and butter of what we do in International Resource Panel, which is actually dealing with the resources, which are the common roots of the triple planetary crisis. When we say natural resources, what do we mean? Biomass, metals, fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals, everything that it's called materials. So everything extracted from Earth are materials. And on the top of that, we have then land and water, which creates then the space of resources. More or less, I will talk about materials, so everything extracted from the Earth. When we were looking how much only the extraction and processing of materials from Earth impacts on triple planetary crisis, because it is the essence of the driver. So what we see in climate, what we see in biodiversity loss and pollution, it's the downstream. These are the consequences. But we have to look where the core reasons lie. And when we analyzed that, we found out that 90% of global land-related biodiversity loss and water stress is related to extracting and processing of materials. Majority, if you can see here, it's related to biomass. So if you want to solve the problem of biodiversity loss and water stress, you can't do it without touching the things which are connected with the biomass. And that means sectors, agriculture, forestry, and a bit also the things which are connected with the oceans. 50% of the global climate impacts are also connected to that, and 1/3 of the air pollution health impacts. I'm not talking here yet about consumption. I'm talking about processing and extraction. So if I translate you this to the last point, if you buy a car, new car, park it, never use it, you have created 1/3 of pollution, because resources needs to be extracted and car needs to be produced, and that creates in the whole process pollution. So if we look to the last 50 years, we are just now in IRP in the production of Global Resource Outlook 24, and this is 2019. Then in the years 70 to 2015, the global material use has globally more than tripled. Per capita, it has almost doubled, which means that majority of that tripling, it's connected to economic development, but to an important extent, it's connected also to the population growth, which is, of course, pretty much normal. And finally, which is really interesting, this black dotted line, which is called material productivity, that's actually the efficiency of the materials per unit of GDP, has been increasing till 2000 and then started to decrease on a global level. How is that possible if it's increasing in all the countries? It is increasing in all the countries. It's possible because we have a structural shift of production from the countries like European, which are more resource efficient, to the production in China, which are less resource efficient. And before the year 2000, we have been buying more of those products which were based here. Now we are buying more products which are produced there, where they are, through the resource efficiency, using more resources than we have done on a global level together. So when you look to disparities across the countries, we have here low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, upper middle incomes, and high-income countries. If we look at through the so-called domestic material consumption, then we can see that upper middle income countries like China, for example, it's a typical case of that countries, are already surpassing high-income countries. Why? Because there is a lot of infrastructure, new cities which are built. But immediately, when you look to the material footprints, which are going one step further, they are asking who is actually consuming the things which are produced. So it goes till the end of the consumption cycle. Then we find out that in high-income countries, we are consuming per capita 13 times more than in low-income countries. So if current trends would continue, global material consumption, according to our estimates, would double again in 2060, by 2060, which leads us to a very simple conclusion. If we want to develop in the future, the only way really to develop is to decouple economic development from the resource use and to decouple both from the environmental impacts. Because if we will not do that, we will hit the walls. And we are not far from there. But according to the IRP, what is also an interesting thing, it's actually not the shortage of various kinds of materials which are driving us that we change our behavior, but it's the impacts of the overuse and the use which actually is causing problems which I have mentioned before. So leaders of the countries didn't meet in Paris because we are getting getting out of oil. No, they met because the overuse of that oil today, it's already causing that problems as we see, and we have to fix them. So it's actually the overuse, and that's why one of the questions of the overproduction and overconsumption, in particular in high-income countries, it's very relevant, and we don't like to ask it because it's a bit uncomfortable, if we are honest. But last two slides I would like to talk about European Union economy, which is extremely fragile. I was talking about that already in Commission during my terms. It's import dependent. More than 50% of energy we are importing, and we see now the consequences of the terrible war which is happening in Ukraine. But it's also the same, be careful, when it comes to materials. So more than, according to the report which was published still during my days, it's most of the critical materials we are import dependent. From 54, more than 90% are coming from the outside, and 19 most critical are coming from China. So we are practically in the same situation there, but not exactly with the same part of the global region. So if you look to energy transition, and that's the last slide before I had to Heather to give us the answers, is this one. In the energy transition, if we look to the shifting from coal and natural gas from materials point of view to offshore wind, solar and nuclear, we will use much, much more materials. And if we look at it from conventional cars to electric cars, the story is the same. So one thing we have to be careful is that we do not fall from one dependency, from one mistake, that was dependency on fossil fuels, to the dependency on materials. And we have to think about that now, because now it's the proper time, and now it's still possible to do it. And that's why the questions, how we could and should actually address meet human needs, not less meet human needs, but meet them in less resource-intensive way, are central for our future. Thank you. Heather, please.
Dzień dobry. Jestem Heather Grabbe.
My name is Heather Grabbe. It's very nice to be in Warsaw, even in January.
You all today, and thank you to Janez for presenting so well these first points about the report. And I just wanted to let you know that we do have a QR code for the report, which everybody is welcome to have, so you can download it directly for reading on the train, on the tram, or other energy efficient form of transport. So I'm going to go into how to implement the European Green Deal in a way that will achieve a more sustainable economy with less resource use. Janez has put out very clearly why it is essential to increase resource efficiency and essentially move our economy from one of massive overconsumption to one that really respects planetary boundaries. And we refer to this as a resilient economy. At the moment, there's an enormous debate in the EU about how to achieve greater resilience in various forms, especially economic resilience. And the circular economy, by changing the system, is an essential way to do that. So what we want to do is to implement the ambitions of the European Green Deal in the best way possible. This is really what's needed to make the European Green Deal implementable. So the ambitions are high on emissions, on the just transition, and we have brought out some very clear policy recommendations. But it's quite hard to see how the implementation is going to happen in the different EU member states. It's not, the European Green Deal doesn't really address the drivers and the pressures that are causing the environmental damage. This is the fundamental point that Janez was making. It doesn't force the EU economies towards greater resource efficiency enough. And it doesn't have the systemic perspective that's needed. Now, that's because of political realities, but it's also because there's been COVID and also the war in Ukraine, which has diverted a lot of energy and attention and time and resources at this critical moment. So the aim of our report is to guide action at all levels of the system, not only EU level, but also member state level, at the national economies, and also at firm level. So it's about the system, it's about the kinds of orientations towards the desired end state, and also how to ensure we can both meet human needs and respect planetary boundaries, the famous donut of Kate Raworth that Janez was referring to. So here you can see basically what's in the report, and it has plenty of visuals, so we will give you the QR code. But basically we have 10 principles from which we derive 30 system-level orientations, 3, I think it's actually now 5 ecosystem-level orientations, and champion orientations too. So I'll just explain briefly what the 10 main compass principles are. They're about redefinition of many aspects of the economy, from resource use, as Janez was talking about, to what is actually prosperity. Prosperity is not necessarily consuming more and more. It's meeting needs more and more, which is not the same thing. Redefining progress, also metrics, incredibly important to change the way we measure aspects of our economy. I think anybody who's reading the newspapers today knows that GDP, gross domestic product, is not a very accurate measure of human well-being at all. So the need to redefine those metrics, but also metrics such as the environmental footprint of goods and services and production methods. For example, their impact on biodiversity is hardly measured at all. What Janez was saying about natural capital not being valued at all, that's all about the metrics. And of course, that then affects how you view competitiveness. It's how governments set incentives. The moment most of the incentives are for ever more consumption. Redefining consumption itself from owning to using, which I'll come on to in a moment, as well as finance, governance, and leadership. So the report goes into these different areas in a lot of detail, and I will leave you to enjoy going into those different areas. And what we did initially was to put out a report primarily about provisioning systems in the European Union itself. So the original, the blue report, A System Change Compass, which came out in 2020, was a guide to how to transform the European economy, so the EU 27, as they are now. Then, and that was about resource-intensive human needs, where basically we go from policy to the real economy, and looking in particular at what are the most resource-intensive human needs. And there are basically 4 of them. One is nutrition. That's a very resource-intensive thing. Agriculture, for example, is responsible for 30% of global emissions. Housing, the built environment, is also very resource-intensive, not only heating our houses, as we know, and offices and so on, but also just building them. The amount of concrete and steel that we still use in construction is more than is absolutely necessary. So what Janez was talking about with regard to the way that we are importing often these materials, because they can be made more cheaply elsewhere, but that doesn't mean that there's less pollution in terms of their production. Then there's mobility, so the need to move to intermodal mobility, and not just everybody having an electric car. Janez, remember, was pointing out how much more resources electric cars take. We need to have different mobility systems rather than everybody owning a car. And then there's the daily functional needs. So these are consumer goods. So these are the four most resource-intensive systems for provisioning human needs. And then you see also there are resource relevant systems which enable and support these provisioning systems. So there are nature-based ones, there's energy, of course, there's circular materials, and then, of course, there's innovation, digitalization. So these support systems also take resources of various kinds. So how do we redefine the incentives to move to a more resource efficient, a more circular economy that uses fewer resources, but still meets human needs, but respects planetary boundaries better? Well, there's a very simple principle that we put forward in this report, very simple and yet absolutely revolutionary. And that's the idea that we go from owning things to using services. Okay, so it's a fundamentally different concept. If you think about these provisioning systems, do you need to own a car to have mobility? Not necessarily. You want to get from A to B. You have a need to get from A to B. You don't need to own a car. Do you need to own a house? Not necessarily. Again, there are plenty of ways in which you can have good shelter and a nice place to live without necessarily owning it. Why would it be helpful to move from owning to using? Well, basically because at the moment, the economic incentives facing economic operators who mostly want to sell things for us to own are not encouraging resource productivity. The opposite. They are encouraging maximum use of resources because basically when you sell as many units as possible, you make the greatest profit. And yet we don't need cars. You know, if you're a car manufacturer, you want to sell as many cars as possible to individuals, but we need to get places. We don't actually need light bulbs, we need light. We don't need to buy a maximum number of chairs, we need to sit. We don't need refrigerators, we need healthy food, which can be kept healthy. We don't even really need CDs. I mean, I still own CDs because I'm getting very old, but my children, they just have Spotify. So we have already moved from owning to using in that respect in our household. And we don't need pesticides, where maximum sales of pesticides are the goal of companies producing them. We need healthy plants. So essentially, we need to rethink ownership to dematerialize, to reduce the use. And that means efficiency has to be complemented with sufficiency. Sufficiency is where we meet human needs. And a really great example of this is the humble refrigerator. So if you think about it, if you are a manufacturer of refrigerators and you're designing a new fridge, you, at the moment, have a big incentive to sell as many fridges as possible. So you don't want your fridge to last all that long, right? You want to be able to come out with a new model which people will buy quite soon. So the only way you can increase your profits is to sell more, not making fridges that last very long. Now, here in Poland, people who bought a fridge, who were lucky enough to buy a fridge before 1989, knew that that fridge may not have been good quality, but it lasted a long time because sales weren't really quite the point. But now with the turbo capitalism that has come to the Polish economy, people buy many fridges in their lifetimes, not just one. Yet, if you thought about it as using rather than owning, what you really need in your home is cooling services. You need your food and your drink to be cooled. So what if the producer of the fridge did not sell you a fridge where you own the fridge? The producer still continues to own the fridge, but they put this fridge in your home and they are responsible for looking after it, ensuring it is energy efficient, repairing it if it breaks down, upgrading it to perhaps, for example, different kinds of temperatures or different services. But they have an incentive to design a completely different kind of fridge, one that is durable, one that is upgradable, one which they take responsibility for from cradle to grave, instead of just selling it to you and hoping it will break down in a few years so that you buy a new one. Now, the fridge example is great. You could apply this also to cars, also to houses, for example. all of these, basically, these very resource-intensive systems need this kind of approach. So how do we get there? This is maybe a little bit small to see, but this is a summary of what's in the European Green Deal. I think it's actually quite small to see, but just basically to tell you, these are the different principles, the different contents of the European Green Deal. On the left side, you've got the climate ambitions, energy, circular economy, and building and renovating for resource efficiency and energy. So it's part of the Green Deal. It's partly there. And then there's also a focus on pollution, biodiversity, agriculture and food chains, and accelerating the shift in mobility. So it is addressing a number of these things that we've identified. On the whole, it's the most holistic and ambitious policy on the planet so far for making the transition to a more sustainable economy. And it was described as a growth strategy that aims to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society, and so on. I'll leave you to read this because you'll get copies of the slides. But essentially, we need, the Green Deal is still lacking the international dimension. We need a better strategic analysis of the trade and the geostrategic consequences of implementation of the European Green Deal and of the Sustainable Development Goals, which it is partly based on, of the United Nations. So we need to move from this internal focus on what's needed to change the European economy to how to change the global economy. And that's why we moved from the blue report, the System Change Compass, to this green report, the International System Change Compass. Because, as Janez was pointing out earlier, we've shifted a huge amount of the production we used to have in Europe to other countries, and that's moved the pollution there, but it's still putting a huge amount of emissions up into the atmosphere and poisoning the soil and the water and so on, damaging nature in other parts of the world, which ultimately damages us as well. Now, this is a very interesting set of figures, which basically show you the degree of neo-colonialism that is built into the current system, the current economic system. It shows you who's benefiting and where the costs are. So basically, the huge impact of raw materials in the developing world, so low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, that's where the raw materials are coming from. So they have a deficit in their raw material trade balance. This is all the stuff that they are exporting to the last category, the high-income countries, who are net importers of an enormous amount of raw materials. So the little grey bubble is the physical trade balance, which is the normal trade statistics, which don't take into account the resource impact. And the resource impact, as you can see, is absolutely huge. Essentially, we take their raw materials and we overconsume them, and then they are left with this imbalance. And that reflects the embedded pollution, water use, carbon emissions, and so on of everything we import. And that matters because in Europe, we tend to pat ourselves on the back and say, in a few years, we will have fewer than 5% of global emissions. We're doing fantastically well. We're going to be the greenest continent on the planet. But in practice, we are creating all of this extraction of raw materials, which causes environmental damage, not only in other countries, but also in the atmosphere with the emissions. And we have to recognise this is also part of our trade balance. So we need a systemic approach. The countries that are most responsible for the current situation needs to take the lead. We set the standards and the behavioural patterns, so we are ethically bound to change them. And we have to lead that transition because that's the only way to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past here in Europe in other regions of the world. But we have a real problem with our economic model because we are still signalling to producers that it's free to destroy natural capital, and we're still sending contradictory messages to consumers who are paying more, for example, for organic food and less environmentally friendly food than they pay for environmentally damaging food, because effectively that's the one that's subsidised, both through the common agricultural policy but also trade policies and so on. So we need a very deep system transformation. And if we wish to avoid the extinction of elephants in the wild, we need to address the elephant in the room, the difficult questions that are not on the table at the moment. So what are the main blind spots? There are three. One is the lack of a holistic vision and approach. We have conflicting policy logics that we're saying we want to go sustainable, and yet we still have enormous incentives to produce ever more, and that means importing ever more raw materials. We also are not addressing the drivers and the pressures that are causing this degradation of the planet. So we need natural resource management to be a much bigger priority and to change the market signals to both consumers and producers. And we need to pay attention to the demand side. If you think about what Europe has done, for example, on energy over the past year, since the 24th of February last year, most of that has been about supply. It's been about ensuring more supplies of energy. And then there has been some reduction in demand for energy. In fact, much more than anybody thought was possible. On the 24th of February, there were Germans saying, there's no way the German economy can use less fuel than it uses now. But actually, Germany was able to cut industrial consumption of energy by 20% between February and December last year. So this focus on the demand side is absolutely vital to, for solutions, but also to address our responsibility in Europe and the equity issues about the fact we extract so much from the global south. So just to give you a quick overview of the main recommendations for policymakers from the International System Change Compass, it's about moving from owning to using. It's about moving from sales to functions. It's about redefining the core incentives, so taxation, subsidies, and so on. It's about putting well-being at the heart of policy. It's about being much more consistent, particularly between supply and demand side, and also looking at a fairer and more equal society and world, and measuring sustainability across the whole life cycle of products and across policy areas, and activating all of the existing financial potential, and looking at innovation in terms of meeting human needs and providing functions rather than thinking about production sectors. So to conclude, we've got to think about the broader context for this European Green Deal, because we can't have a green island in Europe in an increasingly dirty world. If we just green the European economy, we won't get beyond climate change. We won't solve climate change. We will actually continue, maybe even increase resource use and extraction from elsewhere in the world. We have to have a global Green Deal, a global change to a new kind of system. This is a concern that was already raised in the Club of Rome report, The Limits to Growth, which Sandrine Dixson-Declève mentioned in the video. It was published in 1972, 50 years ago, and it already said then that there's a risk of collapse. The world has changed, and if you look at, I won't go through these because I'm out of time, but they predicted already in 1972 all the way that resource use could increase, but also the way that the problems with industrial output ever increasing and human population growing. And yet, at that point in time, the population on the planet 50 years ago was only 3.8 billion, was less than half who we are now. So we've gone from the limits to growth to the growth of limits. There are only two factors in this equation that can change. Either we change the human population, which is neither ethical nor possible, I think, or we change the economic system. So we have to look at the human socio-ecological system of planetary space. And this is finally reaching Davos. You may have noticed that Davos is going on right now with the global elite up there on the Swiss mountains with an enormous carbon footprint for their private planes and all the rest of it. However, they are paying attention a little bit to where this is going. When asked by the World Economic Forum, what are the top 10 risks? If you look at the 2-year horizon, people had, number one, the cost of living crisis, and a lot of non-green concerns. But thinking 10 years ahead, it's all about green, basically. It's about climate, it's about natural disasters, extreme weather, biodiversity collapse, ecosystem collapse, natural resource crises, and so on. And the risks are becoming green themselves. What you've got here is at the moment, a focus on what kind of painkillers can we take to remove the acute pain in the economy without thinking about the chronic disease, which is ultimately going to just get worse. So we have to think about well-being. We have to think about how to achieve that in ways that gives us more stability, more security, avoids further wars over resources. Think how many wars have been fought over resources in the past. This can only get worse, which means a new approach to land, water, oil and gas, minerals, also precious metals, all of which are needed for decarbonisation. We should have learned some lessons from the very hot summer last year, from the record warm temperature here in Warsaw on New Year's Day this year. This is the sign of an extremely disturbed climate. And this kind of unpredictable climatic conditions and therefore their impact on harvests and on all kinds of factors of life, even transport infrastructure, for example, can't work at 40 degrees in many parts of Europe. We've also had a pandemic in recent years, which shows the biorisks of intruding so deeply into nature. And of course, we're having a war in which Russia assumed that as a gas supplier, they wouldn't be opposition to them. We need to change the relationship with nature as an imperative for economics, for security, and for resilience. This is not just one policy area among many. This is the overarching policy area, which needs to influence not just climate policy, but also foreign policy, trade, development, and many others. The choice is ultimately not whether to make this transition to a circular, resilient, and efficient economy, but whether we're going to do it with wisdom and collective effort, or whether we're going to do it with great pain, with more pandemics, with a lot more migration, and with more conflicts. That is the choice before us. So we're looking forward to what you have to say about it, and thank you very much for reading our report.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much for this very concise journey, this overview of the report, which is truly worth reading. I encourage you to download it and read at least the executive summary, which is 30 pages long. So that gives you an idea of the complexity of this study, of this report, which nonetheless, I think is indispensable, is necessary if we are to envisage a future that might not be easy, but I propose we start talking about what we've just heard. And first up, let's have Marcin Korolec. First of all, I wanted to thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I think it's fairly difficult to comment on such an extensive report in a few words. Nonetheless, I'll give it a shot. I'll try and present a few remarks. I think that this is a wonderful invitation and encouragement for us to hold meetings like this, not just in European capitals, but also in big cities in the US and China and elsewhere around the world. And I think that our annual meetings at COP are a global retreat where we muse on how to achieve change, where we reflect on how change and development, shared development, not just the development and growth of the high-income world. I'd begin by a few words about the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is just as the Paris Agreement, it's an invitation to carry out a rapid, profound, and dynamic civilizational change, economic and industrial change ever. This is unprecedented. Such a rapid and urgent change, socially, industrially, or in economic terms, had never been attempted in history, and we have 27 years in which to achieve it. We don't have some 27 years. We have exactly 27 years, specifically the 27 years ahead of us. And I think that's essential. That's really important because currently we're in an international context and a system of international relations which is based on rivalry, if not to use the word conflict. The European Green Deal means new technology, means new skills, and also I think it's a new geography, a new industrial geography of Europe, by which I mean a new investment, new projects, new would be more common in northern Sweden than in the Ruhr and Silesia, the Ruhr Basin or Silesia, because of the net zero emissions. And also we have the prospective new industrial geography that would mean a serious internal challenge for the European Union, because these current centers of industry like the Ruhr Basin or Silesia in Poland or the Visegrad Group, which is the automobile manufacturer for Europe. So something would need to be done with these industrial basins. And in European regulations, we're phasing this in. We have the Transition Fund. We have the Social Climate Fund as a component. So in European regulations, this is something that's becoming a part of the legal system. It's being built in to the system. And today's report is important. The report we're discussing is a reminder that we need to apply this thinking in our external international relations, not just internally within Europe, and that a just transition cannot be restricted to the boundaries of Europe. The compass, the report, has been presented, and it was completed just before the U.S. administration presented the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'd like to comment to this. There's a Polish saying, I don't know if it translates, but God save me from my friends, because I can cope, I can deal with my enemies. The Americans dragged their feet. They were reluctant to commit to the Paris Agreement. But when the administration changed after the presidential elections, they behaved like an elephant, like a bull in a china shop, and they did what they did. So there's a difference here between Europe and the US. To it, we have shared roots, we have shared values, we have shared image, vision of democracy, but we have different ways of operating as state organisms, the EU and the US, where Europe puts in place a legal and regulatory system framework inviting or forcing our citizens and our companies to act in a specific way, to consume in a specific way, to operate in a specific way. Our friends across the ocean, across the pond, throw money out of a helicopter and say you should go in this direction. This is the way you ought to go, which means that today while in Europe we're looking at difficulties, and there will be a very demanding regulatory framework. I beg to differ with one of the things that was said here, that it will be difficult to implement the European Green Deal, and namely all these provisions are not directives but regulations, so implementing will be direct and immediate. So while Europe will have problems, intentional difficulties, limitations, in the same areas or areas of the economy, the Americans are just throwing money and encouraging people to profit. And it's not subsidies, investment subsidies, but also they're subsidizing operating costs. I don't want to talk about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, but this disparity, this imbalance is a huge challenge for us, and it's a challenge facing the European social model, because if we fail to respond in a similar way, then our vitality, our most innovative companies will simply move to the US, will move shop to the United States. And we are living in a conflicted world. And who will have a primacy in technology, the US or Europe, or who will be the leader in technology, the US, Europe, or China? And I think that Europe doesn't really have a choice. Europe will have to apply very similar measures like those in the Inflation Reduction Act, and the answer, what the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said in Davos 2 or 3 days ago wasn't specific, because we're not there yet. We don't have a ready program in place. We will, however, have to provide a similar response. We'll have to throw lots of money around to save European industry. And if this happens, I'm worried. I fear that these two huge cash flows in the States and in the Europe for innovative investment, for innovative industry in green technology, will curb all innovation outside Europe and the United States, because the conditions here will be too conducive, too appealing, and there will be a brain drain. And this is a problem for the developing countries mentioned in this report. I also have a comment regarding redefining consumption, by which I mean I'd like to agree with this call, this proposition, but I have a problem, namely, if we need to shift our civilization to net zero, then we must create new industries and new skills in these innovative areas. So we need to produce net zero emitting cars. We need to manufacture heat pumps. We need to manufacture solar energy panels. We need to manufacture all these goods, all these commodities. Therefore, consumption can't be limited, because it won't be sufficiently resilient, or it won't be able to compete with the United States, much less, not to mention China or other. I'd like to conclude, however, on a more optimistic note. And I wanted to say that I'm convinced that a different reality, a different world is possible. And at the end of the day, this different reality need not be very far off. Because if we take a look at the war in Ukraine, it is, in fact, a war around values. And after the victory in Ukraine, after Ukraine wins this war, I believe that it'll be time to build a world based not on competition and conflict as it is today, but a world that's built on values and a goal, because this is a war that's about values. So victory in Ukraine, Ukrainian victory, will take us closer to achieving the vision described in this report. Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting intervention, and now I want to open the floor to a discussion and invite our panelists, who I will present in alphabetical order. Elżbieta Bieńkowska, former Deputy Prime Minister of Poland and former EU Commissioner. We also have Małgorzata Bonikowska, the President of the Center for International Relations. Dominika Lasota is a climate activist associated with Fridays for Future. And Mateusz Piotrowski, who's a social and environmental activist, and he's the co-founder of the Patient Europe or initiative, among others. And I suggest we have a first round. Of course, we have an hour left, so I think we have plenty of time to discuss these issues and also ask our panelists, our presenters, to comment on what will be said shortly, as well as comments from the audience. Could I ask each of you to comment on the report? I will be asking targeted questions. I want to begin with Małgorzata Bonikowska. Marcin Korolec mentioned the competition between the US and the European Union as regards green transition. Marcin Korolec pointed out the threats that this has for the European social model, but also for the rest of the world. Not just the reestablishment of a neo-colonial model, but an extractive model that will drain resources, especially intellectual resources. But maybe there's also something positive. Maybe this competition will prove invigorating. Maybe this competition will be conducive to progress. So is it a threat, or does it also have its good sides, this competition that's emerging between the main centers? Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for this very interesting report, which is being published at a good time. It's being published at a time when we're reflecting, when we're thinking about our world, and not only as regards the green dimension. I think that competition per se is never a bad thing. But the basic question as I see it is, are we as individuals, as people, as leaders, ready to think what to do in the future? How should we work? How should we develop in terms of a global community? Because climate change makes it incumbent upon us. It affects all of us, and in a century, if we don't act now, we'll all have a problem. All of us will have a problem, rich and poor alike, Africa, Europe, and the United States. And so if we're thinking what should be done, what the next step ought to be, the dilemma facing us, as I see it, is, can we use multilateral mechanisms, international organizations, the law, and perhaps the conviction among leaders that cooperation is necessary to tackle the problems we consider to be global, problems which affect all of us. And then it's like the European Union. Sometimes we have different interests, conflicting interests, but we have an overriding objective, thanks to which it's been sticking together. It's like Schumann's vision. If in Europe we can have this approach to problem solving, to the solving of universal or shared problems, maybe we can take it further and expand this approach to the whole world. The European Union could be a pilot project, sort of, and that's one possibility which is being called for by the global South. These countries from the global South, and it's not only about climate, are accusing the West, are accusing the North of being selfish. Where it's convenient, the North has a global approach, but where it isn't, we have a regional approach, and then we have the Americans, we have the Europeans, and we do things our way. And also within the European Union, to take it down a level, it's also similar. Where it's convenient, we do it at community level, but where it's not convenient, some countries go their own way. They pursue their own domestic interest. So looking realistically, that's an obstacle we can't surmount as yet. Well, we can't. Because for the time being, especially in times of crisis, as it turns out, what prevails is a national or regional approach. And that's what we're witnessing. But the greatest challenges, and there's a plethora of challenges, but there's different types of challenges. And the challenges that are the greatest threat to humanity are global in nature, and that's my first comment. The second comment, and it's related to what you asked, it's perception. It's the perspective we adopt when looking at this study. If we see it from a business perspective, and business sets the tone, definitely in the United States, because it's a country where the business community has a lot to say, and also innovative business. Mind you, it's not just big tech, but big business, global, multinationals, the internet, innovation, that's also business, so is industry. In Europe, perhaps to a lesser degree, but we also need to take into account this perspective, this angle, and we need to think how business will see self-restriction. We are in a dead end, because whether we like it or not, business is all about profit, and profit comes from sales. So I was really riveted by your concept of shifting to services from ownership. That's an idea. When the refrigerator, which can be produced once, manufactured once, but can serve as a source of profit from renting it out to multiple users, if business sees the advantage, because business, by definition, most of it is reconstructive, it reproduces. But to do something disruptive like Steve Jobs did with the iPhone, that doesn't happen every day. You don't have that in business. In business, it's version 3.15 or whatever of a product that's been invented ages ago. But fundamental disruptive change happens truly rarely. And this approach from a product to a service-oriented approach at a macro level, I'm not talking about e-commerce or the digital market, I'm talking about industry, industrial production. This is something worth looking at, worth focusing on, because if business sees this as an opportunity, then business will be the greatest supporter of this transition, because we'll have new income flows, new forms of activity, new job opportunities, which also correspond to consumer choice or consumer demand, but they lack the services. And if we could combine these two things, an international policy perspective and focusing on the global south, and also being mindful or remembering that business doesn't want its profits cut, but it can make money in different ways. There's telecoms, for instance, that migrated or that reinvented themselves as tech companies. So this is being done, but to make it more extensive, we need to work on changing perspective.
Przejęła mikrofon.
We'll now go to Dominika Lasota. So now I would like to ask about this redefining, so shifting away from products to services. Jeremy Rifkin wrote about this back in the year 2000 in The Age of Access, proclaiming that that age has already come. I don't know if you were around. Some time has passed and we've gone back to saying the same thing. But in the meantime, we've produced over 40% of global emissions that have been produced since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So just defining the conditions for change does not a change make. And you talked about this in your interview for Gazeta Wyborcza, the tension between personal versus systemic change. Where do you see the challenges? I think this is a difficult question. I think that considering social moods in Poland over the last couple of years, especially last year, which have changed so much in favor of a just transition, I think the blockage is somewhere else, not on the side of individuals. I've talked to a lot of people who tell me they've taken all the small steps, segregating their trash, riding bikes instead of taking the car, turning off the lights. They're very aware and they do whatever they can as long as they're able to make those changes. They can afford to make those changes. So it really struck me that we're talking so little about the responsibility of the state, of those who govern, because in my view, considering the urgency of the crisis we are in, I think that I would expect the most from those who are in power. And we know that in Poland, but this is a pattern all across Europe. Companies in the fossil fuel business, which this sector is at the root of the crisis. Many of these companies are friends with the political scene, with the politicians in their country, both in Poland and in Europe. And I think that although it's nice to consider alternative ways to consider this shift from ownership to services, however, we're still not addressing the problem at the source. So we're saying that we need just transition. We need to ensure that everybody has access to renewable energy. Still, we get questions from people in this sector who say, well, we need financing to do that. We need money. We need projects to transition to renewables. So to make that available, we need government to step in. We need energy, big energy companies to step in, and they're making huge money on the current energy crisis and on the war, while politicians seem to have renounced their responsibility. So what I'd like to see is more thought about how we can generate social synergy. I think people have the energy, people have the willingness. I think 75% of Poles want to transition to offshore and onshore wind. So, but still, this doesn't lead to political and legislative decisions and actions. So I'm just wondering, how do we make sure that people in those sectors are protected? People and companies who need to transition, how do we make sure that they can afford it? Climate policy needs to address people's fears about the world, but also their fears about being able to last on their salaries till the end of the month. And I think this is a good moment to pass the mic to Mrs. Bieńkowska, who was a policymaker in Poland and in the EU. So you are actually sort of the addressee of the issues raised by Dominika on the part of politicians responsible for transition. Desmond Tutu once said that Poland was one of the richest countries in the world, and yet was acting like a country of the global south, arguing that we can't afford a transition. My question is, where are we at right now? We as Poland, are we more the country who's putting a brake on this process, or we are. To what extent then can we co-create a non-neo-colonial EU policy for the sake of a just global transition? If I can just refer to the report, it was said many times that this is the perfect moment for this report to come out. However, I had several conversations preparing for this panel and for reading this report, conversations mostly with my European colleagues. Actually, the most pressing question in the European Commission right now is, well, we know we have the Green Deal. It's on the table. It will happen. It's been around for a couple of years. We fought to make it happen. Both legislators and those who wanted to bring about this Green Deal and industries that were against. So we fought about the shape of this Green Deal, and now it's here. So now the main question in Europe is, it's also being asked by countries. They say we cannot limit the Green Deal to Europe alone. This Green Deal will have very far-reaching consequences for all of us for all of our trade partners. For instance, we are introducing a carbon tax, and this will have serious consequences for those selling us their products. They will have to adapt to what we are imposing. However, on the other side, and again, I'd like to refer to the report, the European Green Deal cannot be limited to Europe. And this is probably the most serious question about the EGD. How do we deal with its global consequences? How do we handle those? But also, how do we globalize the EGD? We know that there are a lot of countries in the south, essentially all across the globe, which need to be persuaded that they should come with us. Because Europe is just a small piece of the world. And let me tell you, just yesterday, this is very interesting. It's an example of how this thinking is permeating, how it's all happening. Yesterday, a deal was made among trade ministers on climate, and it's a global deal. It's a global agreement. The EU is a deputy leader. There's New Zealand, Kenya, and Ecuador. And this agreement is going towards making these ideas that we have so not just selling, but also how to use the EU budget towards green purposes. The budget is already very green. There's even an instrument for international cooperation and good neighborhood, over 80 billion euros, which is to go towards green investments all over the world, not in the EU, not even in the EU's neighborhood, but even further afield. However, when it comes to Poland, well, where do I start? Well, I think many years ago, people were not told in simple terms, and politicians are guilty. I kept repeating this. I was not heard. I was not aware of how much power I wielded, which is a very bad thing. It's very bad not to know how much you can do or say. People used to say there will be no more mines in 20 years. We had 100,000 miners in Silesia who were told to requalify, to start companies, to change jobs. I come from Silesia, and that's where I came from to attend this meeting. In Silesia, aside from labor unions, there are no people who want to work in mines. It's a huge region which has a huge industry, a huge potential, and it's not the people working in the coal industry, it's not them who are stopping this transition. Over the last decade, we've done absolutely nothing, and we could have, even if the wind law had not been killed back in 2005. If we had distributed more money towards heat pumps and photovoltaics, we would be somewhere else. We'd be in a different position today. It's simple, and yet it's so difficult. We know that young people, even old people like myself, have gone fully green, but there's still a large group of people, including those who are ruling us today, who think, well, no, let's do it the old way. And this year is pivotal in Poland. In Europe, the Russian aggression has accelerated the Green Deal, has accelerated all those measures happening in Europe. However, in Poland, we see the opposite effect. In Poland, we're stagnating, we've not budged. So now I've sung the praises of Silesia, but let's not say that there are change stoppers there. They're not a big group. The share of extraction in Silesia's GDP is 2%. 2% of Silesia's GDP comes from mining. So stop telling tall tales about these social effects, which won't happen because everybody knows that mining is a thing of the past. It's declining. I also have a remark regarding the US and TTIP, so the US-Europe agreement. Unfortunately, for many years, I've dealt with the industry and companies in the EU. For many years, it was the US that was draining talent from Europe, not because of IRA, but because it had better financing for different things. So for startups, for instance, so European companies, it's not that we are not innovative. We're just as innovative as the US. We're just as smart. We're just as well educated. But whenever European companies needed money to scale up, they would take 1 or 2 grants from Europe, and they could get no more. So they would go to the States, where the funding was virtually unlimited. So that was one thing. The other thing is that I, unfortunately, have seen a lot of partnerships, friendships, and so on, and I'm somewhat skeptical. I think people look after themselves. They tend to look after themselves rather than think globally. But we are facing a crisis. We've come up against the wall when it comes to the future of humanity, the future of the planet. We're not going to be around in 100 years, but somebody will be, and we should be thinking about it. So we're driving into a wall. We're on a collision course. So I don't think highly of the human condition. I don't think highly of humanity, but I think that cooperation of that kind will become possible when it turns out that it's imminent. Something is happening. We're desperate. We have to go around wearing anti-pollution masks, we can't go outdoors. It has to get that bad before we get together and act. Of course, it would be best to get that sort of cooperation going as soon as possible. It's necessary. The EGD is currently the EU's foreign policy. And it would be well for this foreign policy to be conducted so that we could all speak in one voice. We could all speak one language. I don't know if it's going to happen. I don't know if it's possible. In fact, with Marcin, we had a little exchange earlier. And I told him I would say this. Nobody is talking about agriculture. Some things were said about agriculture. And food security, but it needs to be said. That's agriculture is the elephant in the room. This is something that nobody is touching. Nobody wants to deal with. Agriculture is something, mass meat production and supported agriculture, subsidized agriculture. This is something that is a huge contributor to the climate crisis. Nobody wants to say it out loud. Everyone's afraid in Europe and in the States, but this is a problem to reckon with. It's the perfect time to talk about it because the Green Deal is here. Even if we close our eyes and cover our ears and pretend it's not here, it's here. The regulations are in place. Poland, whether consciously or unawares, has agreed to them to get money or for other reasons. What's important is that these regulations will be implemented in Polish law and they will be realized. So it's happening, and it's good to talk about this. Also, with regard to the circular economy, sorry, this is a bit of a stream of consciousness on my part. Just one last thing, because we talked about, we said we won't own things, but rather we'll rent them or we'll purchase services. I was at a congress 5 years ago saying this. We don't know what the world would be like, but we probably won't have big things anymore. We'll simply be renting them. We'll be renting cars, fridges, although I hadn't thought of fridges back then. Mostly transportation is the area we think of. So we're facing a green revolution plus a digital revolution plus a demographic revolution. The world population is growing, and it's growing faster and faster, and this is truly driving this planet to extinction, and we should stop it.
Thank you very much, Mateusz. The last time we met was in Silesia, and Dominika was also there on Coal Miners' Day in a coal mine. So it was a congress of coal miners and climate activists, which seemed incompatible, but it worked very well, and you were kind of speaking, you were on the same page. So this assuming that the conflict between actors is inevitable might be a preconception, perhaps strange bedfellows or strange unexpected alliances, an alliance of the global north and the global south. Perhaps that's also conceivable. It's conceivable, it's possible, but it won't happen on its own. All by itself. And now a word about the report. I really recommend this report, which contains ambitious but realist and necessary premises for the reasons we've mentioned, but also for geopolitical reasons. We'll be getting back to Silesia in a moment, but first a brief excursion into the global south, which we've been talking about. And the report is about the global south to a large extent. I just got back from Sri Lanka, and that's a country. And whoever I spoke to in government, the way they see Russia's invasion of Ukraine is entirely different than the way we see it here. their conviction, their belief that the countries of the South have a moral obligation to support the West that's filtered through the story of colonialism as well as economic relations, which many of these countries see as neo-colonial. And we want and we need, I'll be polemical with regard to what Elżbieta Bieńkowska said. We need to come to an agreement with trade unions. We need to offer them something. If the Green Deal is to work, it has to be a deal where both sides, both parties stand to benefit. And the same goes for North-South relations. The report is about the transfer of technology, which is necessary if these countries aren't to go down the same path we did. And the terms and conditions of this technology transfer need to be negotiated politically. For instance, waiving intellectual property rights and other issues that this report mentions. There's also investment. There's the way these countries, the countries of the global South, are treated. It's a question of prestige, and there's also a question of dignity. Not just as beneficiaries of aid, beneficiaries of technology, but also as contributors, as providers of solutions that we can adopt. I think the second most polluting industry is fashion. One of the top polluters is the textile industry, and there's no greenwashed, transparent. So if somebody wants to buy a garment that was produced in a green way, in a fair trade way, so tracing that takes a lot of time, but they came up with an idea in Sri Lanka. I spoke to Ajay Pearson, who's a fashion designer, and he's also developed a system that he wants to put in place in Europe as well, in the European market. So the solutions they come up with, the global South has a lot to offer in terms of solutions, and so we need to take that into account. And Poland may have an important role to play because we're not seen as a colonial country, never mind our relations with Ukraine, but the global South. But the global South doesn't see us as a colonial power. Our guests from abroad might know Ryszard Kapuscinski, the author of The Emperor, among others. I'm sure he's very well known in the global South as somebody who spoke for them. And if Ryszard Kapuscinski had went to those countries with a good deal, to countries which are straddling the fence between China, Russia, and the West, so somebody like that would be an important resource, would be an important asset that Poland could provide. And it's also in Poland's national interest to be this kind of intermediary, perhaps. I don't want to get into a discussion on coal regions. We're very much focused on Silesia. Bełchatów, our eastern Wielkopolska, did a lot, has achieved a lot, but there's a single industry region. In Silesia, they have other industries, but in Silesia there are other factors. I recently was helping my friends from the coal miners, the miners' union, organize this miners' day. It's an important thing in Silesian identity. One of the attendants was Szczepan Twardoch, a popular Polish writer who writes in the Silesian, whose grandfather was killed in a Silesian uprising. And it's not a question of whether they have money, it's a question of whether they're empowered, whether they have dignity, whether they're treated with dignity. And it's also, and here I want to move to my one critical remark that I want to address, I want to make regarding the entire report, or perhaps the paradigm it adopts. It's partly a critique, partly a question. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of friends who vote not just for conservatives, but for the radical, hardcore right. I have a lot of. Okay, it's good to know people like that, because Otherwise, the risk is that this ambitious idea will fizzle out because of the backlash. The social backlash is underestimated. If my friends who vote for Konfederacja, Polish right-wing party, if you told them about moving from ownership to using, they'd ask, okay, but who'll own the things I use? And that's a critique I have regarding Jeremy Rifkin. It's a question on Spotify. So how much do artists get and how much does Spotify get? It's like Uber, another, the sharing economy and so on. I don't need a car, I can get an Uber. But what's the situation of an Uber employee and the situation of the consumer? We're living in times of crisis. I'm not talking about people who own 16 apartments for rent, but if somebody owns an apartment in Poland, if they have a flat of their own, so that's one of the last bastions. It's one of the resources that keeps them from precarity, from being dependent on banks that raise mortgage payments. So the fear of the great reset of property being taken away by the state and corporations. So there's this fear of this great reset. And that's my question. And I'm looking forward to the answer by the authors of the report. What about the enforcement mechanisms? How do you propose to enforce all of this? Who makes sure these things are implemented? What are the sanctions potential? What's the potential political composition? You mention young people, but also other groups, trade unions. But this is a big question. So who will be supervising this, overseeing this process? And who was watching the watchmen? So what are the mechanisms of social oversight over the implementation of these mechanisms that are provided? I wouldn't dismiss the role of national states. I wouldn't dismiss existing institutions such as trade unions, but also protest movements who need to be treated seriously, not pacified, appeased with promises, but and agriculture. We see the Netherlands. There's protests in the Netherlands, protests in Poland, and the doubts put forward, voiced by farmers who express and people who express the interests of people in rural areas. So these also need to be taken very seriously. And my chief problem, my main question has to do with, or shouldn't we look, and literally two things. Okay, this is a challenge that in 1945 was faced by the Labour Party in the UK. It had to do two things. On the home front, in England, asking people to make sacrifices during the war, what could they offer them in exchange? And that led to the emergence of the welfare state in the UK. And how do you transition from empire to commonwealth? And that was the global challenge they faced. So I think that if you look at the report, there's only one block, only one element of the causes of the success, of the reasons behind the success of the Labour Party. And so first, there was a tradition that's highlighted in the report, the Fabianist technocratic tradition, which is necessary, there's this need for good management. It needs to be taken into account, but it wouldn't succeed without the participation of the trade unions and without the role played, without the participation of broader and a more critical who call into account this grassroots tradition of being critical of anything imposed top-down, trickling down from the experts to the common people who need to comply. So it's a question of self-determination. Thank you. I'll have one brief question at the end, but first let's ask our audience whether they have any questions. Since some questions were addressed to our authors, we'll give them some time to answer, and then we'll have a closing round. Are there any? Let's begin with Mr. Truszczyński. Thank you very much. Jan Truszczyński. I would like to share a concern I have that has not been addressed today and which I think is important. I teach European integration at a private university in Warsaw. Two classes. One of the subjects is there's an hour-long lecture on climate change and energy policy. At the beginning of these lectures, of these classes, I asked my students the same question. Who of you in high school or at university have ever attended a lecture or a course on climate change? There's 100 students in the auditorium. They're from everybody from sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, Asia, Southeast Asia, none of them. So whoever attended a lecture, a panel discussion, a presentation on climate change? And one person raises their hand, maybe two at best. So I conclude that the education system is not keeping up, and it's not devoting sufficient attention to climate change. It doesn't mobilize young people. It doesn't provide them the necessary information, nor does the school system help raise awareness of the need for change and to shape that change so as to keep them equitable. And okay, this wasn't a question, this was a remark. Thank you, but we will take that into account. We'll comment. The lady in the back, yes. Katarzyna Naklimowicz, Collegium Civitas.
English, because my comment will be a direct response to the speech and presentation by Ms. Grabbe.
Mam tylko prośbę o króciutkie wypowiedzi, żebyśmy dali szansę na odpowiedź, bo musimy skończyć.
If you could just keep it brief, please.
First of all, thank you for this very important and useful discussion and for raising especially when it comes to raising awareness about various challenges, but also alternative solutions. I just have an impression that we're really focusing here on this economic aspect and changing our economic model, while our is actually, I guess, also not exactly our, while in many cases that was a model that was, I guess that I understood well that you mean the neoliberal capitalist model of economy that was in many cases imposed. So we've heard actually quite little also about the aspect of changing the model of politics. And I was also quite surprised how little information about that I could find in the report. So mainly if we really want to achieve real change, the main focus actually, apart from economy, when we talk about systemic change and transition, that should be about our political models and public decision making. To give a concrete example, because I think this is mainly the question of legitimacy, the so-called legitimacy of power. So if we want the support and general acceptance of policies that are being, in this case, clearly imposed from the top, we should basically change the pyramid of decision making from the top to from the top down
Proszę bardzo,
to
nie o
bottom
korefera,
up.
tylko zwieńczenie pytania.
There are not only alternative models of economy, there are also alternative models of politics, of democracy, and here I mean especially participatory and deliberative democracy models, as well as various digital tools, for example, right? So the so-called democratic innovations that we should also talk about. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Tak.
Thank you very much. Yes, I just wanted to give our guests a chance to comment.
Lydia Wojtal. I run an international network of think tanks dealing with energy transition. And our model is something that is aimed at in the report. So exporting the Green Deal, but in a way that is appropriate to the situation in a given country. We've said a lot about what should be changed, but the issue of implementation has not been studied fully yet. It's not clear how it should proceed. From our work, it seems that we should be exporting a lot of the solutions, especially with regard to design or technological change. However, we need to consider that every country has its own special problems and the solutions also need to be specific to that country. So exporting the Green Deal is not so simple. And first of all, we need to ask what they need, what the other countries need. The answer that we get will inform what we should be delivering within the framework of international cooperation. Just transition in Poland is not just transition in Colombia, South Africa, or another country. So first of all, we should ask about the problems that need to be solved before we start supplying solutions. One more question, the last one. Institute for Eco-Development. Thank you so much for the report. Thank you to Janez, whom I know personally, and thank you to Heather. This is a remark. What we are talking about is not an economic problem. It's not a political problem. It's not a social problem in the narrow sense of the term. It's a cultural problem. A problem of culture. We need to look at what is happening like the same way astronauts looked at the Earth from the moon, like in that famous picture. We need to think in planetary terms. If we do not get people to think this way, then people in search of identity will identify with various groups that will not contribute to our goal. So I think that's a change we need to make, a change in our language and how we persuade people. Not with an EU representative going to Africa and saying, well, listen, we're going to tell you what to do now. It has to be done together. They need to be persuaded to come to the same conclusion. Unless it might happen that a planetary danger will materialize, and only then will we organize ourselves to act together and change something. But there is an opportunity. The pandemic has taught us that we can act together globally. That's all from me. And one more question here in the back with this gentleman. It's a question, not a comment. Paweł Szybulski, Greenpeace, Poland. Thank you very much for the opportunity to read the report. Thank you to Mrs. Bieńkowska for highlighting responsibility for past decisions. I have a question to Mrs. Bieńkowska and Mr. Korolec. What sort of lessons can we get from you as representatives of civil society in order to make sure that people like yourselves who are in power or will be in power in the future, I know, but you were in politics and you maybe have some lessons for us, some lessons from your actions or from Mr. Korolec's, who back when he was minister, we are still talking about the decarbonization of electronics. Since that's behind us, that's behind you, some suggestions, please, as to what to do. What would have worked for you back then? What was it that we failed to do as civil society to make you budge back when you were in politics? Heather? Could we get a microphone?
I'll stand here maybe so everybody can see me. So thank you very much for these very interesting comments, questions, remarks, observations from experience. We are at the start of an enormous change, a huge system change, and the political, economic, social and cultural implications of it, we're only just beginning to grasp. And that's why this kind of discussion is so important, to look at all of the different elements of it. What we've tried to do with this report is not to answer all of the questions. And we didn't take on changing the political system because we thought that maybe changing the economic system was enough to start with. And then we come into the rest. But I think the various points that have been made about the political repercussions are really important, because if the transition is not accepted and it's not seen as just, it's not going to happen. There are enormous interests which are built into the existing system. The lobbying power of those who benefit from the status quo enormously outgauges the lobbying power of those who want change, although I'm glad to see that Dominika and those of her generation are pushing in the other direction with a new kind of energy. And this has made, I think, a decisive difference. We would not have the European Green Deal today if there hadn't been the enormous mobilization of Fridays for the Future and others out on the streets in 2017, 18, 19. That made all the difference in changing the framework. And that shows that these catalytic moments in politics can actually push for a change in a system which we know is failing many people, which doesn't actually serve human needs very well. Now, I think it's absolutely true. We had a comment about innovation in democracy. This would help enormously. If we look at the various climate assemblies, for example, and other methods of deliberative democracy here in Poland, also in a lot of cities and regions in Europe, when people are presented with the real economic policy choices and there's an informed discussion, they are much more supportive of the transition because they see how it can serve them, how it can be incorporated into their daily lives. And then it's not a top-down imposition. They can actually have a role in it. But that means that we need, again, those who benefit from the existing system to give up some power, and that's a difficult thing. So I just wanted to come back to the question that Mateusz asked about who will enforce all of this and who will monitor it and so on. This can't just be done from EU level. It's very important to have the policy framework set at EU level because, number one, something that the EU is very good at is thinking long term. It's pretty poor at short-term responsiveness and crisis management. As Elżbieta knows, it's very slow-moving, lowest common denominator. But in terms of setting 20-year frameworks like the Single Market Programme, for example, or the Schengen area, the EU is quite good at this. So it's very important that this system change is planned at EU level. But the implementation is going to be national, because that's where most of the resources are, especially fiscal resources, and things like taxation systems, which are essential to changing the incentives. And a lot of the implementation will not be done by the state at all. It will be done by the private sector. And I think there were some very interesting comments made by Małgorzata about the role of multilateral institutions and companies, because when already you see in a lot of sectors that the sustainable green method of production is becoming more competitive than the old extractive and fossil fuel-based alternative. We're starting to see this with energy, for example. We also see that it's coming also in other sectors. That then changes everything, because companies have the incentive to make that shift without being forced into it by the state. And in fact, in some sectors, it's companies that are lobbying government to go faster. But we need that to happen across the economy much faster than it's happening, because we don't have very much time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned us we have now about 7 years before we reach the tipping points just on climate, let alone biodiversity collapse, before we reach tipping points where not only do we have no chance of 1.5 degrees being the limit of global warming, but we start to enter permanent melting of glaciers, polar ice caps and so on, which we cannot reverse. It's becoming irreversible within the next few years. So it's the speed of the change which is needed, which means that the politics has to work at many levels in a very positive way, which is why it's vital to have civil society involved. The private sector has an enormous role to play. And the reasoning behind this report is not that we have all the answers, and they're certainly not the answers for every country. These are general principles that provide a compass. I mean, the compass doesn't tell you which road to take. Okay, when you hold the compass in your hand, it tells you which direction is north, and therefore which direction you should be heading in. And then you have to choose which fork in the road to take. You have to decide how to overcome the obstacle in the road. So that's what the report aims to do. It's to set the general guidelines and to set out particularly this very neglected and misunderstood element of resource use. If you listen to the COP discussions, it's all about climate. If you listen to most politicians, it's just about emissions. But frankly, emissions could stop tomorrow and we would still be facing devastating loss of biodiversity, devastation in terms of the pollution and the damage caused by extractive industries. So we've got to think about these neglected elements, and that's what we have aimed to bring to this debate.
Thanks a lot. Janez, would you like to add something?
After this debate, it's impossible to stay in the seat. I think the first thing which I would like to explain is basics. We need to agree where actually we are. And we are in a charming mass suicide. That's where we are. So if I just repeat few of the facts, 50 years ago, it was 3.8 billion on the planet. Now it's over 8 billion on the planet. The world 50 years ago was not the same as it's today at all. And it is essential to understand that a lot of challenges which we are commonly facing are totally different. We are the first generation ever on the planet which is living in a world which is interconnected and interdependent. Just look, from pandemics to climate change, to trade, to whatever you wish, to internet, and I could continue. Even the Second World War was not World War yet. It was many local wars on a global scale. But now we are interconnected, which means that we need to work together, that we need to cooperate, and that sharing our own, that our responsibility is much bigger than it was just a generation ago, and that sharing sovereignty, it's many times the best way to keep whatever sovereignty we can keep, or we will lose altogether. So that's where we are. And I think it's cooperation, it's an absolute must. And I can just name you two things to which the Dasgupta report, it was about economics of biodiversity, where it landed, which are the two major problems which, at least from this economic point of view, or even broader, why we are failing. We don't have a governance at all which could deal with those problems. And second, we are considering humans as external to nature and not part of nature. And due to those two failures, we are failing horizontally on many scales. So the first thing I think we should fix in these relations is between global north and global south, because if we in global north don't take that seriously, then I don't know how at the end, then stop talking about exporting the Green Deal and everything that, because it will not end up well. It is clear that also US and EU relations and era, all are important. And I think that if we are smart enough, we will hopefully not see that as an attack, because finally Americans are doing something good. And let's rather use it and put it in our system also. But with just one remark, if we think that technological innovation will solve all the problems, we are mistaken. It will not. So we need deeper. We need to go deeper. So fixing the wrong model will not make the model right. And I think it's quite important that we understand that. Second point which I want to address, it's about young generation. It's what we are doing currently, it's actually pocketing benefits today and indebting our future generations. We are indebting them financially, we are indebting them also by depletion of natural capital. That's what we are doing. So it means that, but on the other hand, the young generation is much less ownership bias than our generation. So we have the chance to use the power of the change of young generation to fix the world. And we desperately need a kind of intergenerational pact and cooperation between both of us, because that's the only way how we can start fixing your future. So currently what we do is we adults pocket the money and subsidize you. So that's what we do. But that's not actually, that is increasing this social unfairness, and I think it's simply wrong way to do. And on Mateusz, on the enforcement mechanisms, there are two fundamental preconditions if we want to succeed. One is to marry the ecological transition with the social, because if we don't do that, we can dream on. Because anything you do needs to be socially acceptable. If it's not socially acceptable, it will not fly. And the second is the coalition which we have created. So anything which I was proposing as Commissioner for Environment didn't fly from one reason, because I was Commissioner for Environment. Because I was immediately suspicious, whatever I put on the table. So you need a broader coalition. We need to understand that the things which we are talking, by fixing also the climate, biodiversity, and other systems, are basically, in fact, about peace and war in the future, about stability and security in the future, about equality of the future. If we don't fix that, we will not have the other answers. And the last thing which I would like to say, yeah, of course it's a cultural problem at the end of the day, and we all know that, and we can say also many of the things we can add to that, democratic problem and so on. And by the way, Heather, when we talked about politics, it's actually addressed, but it's not in this report, it's in the first report. In the report which talks about, and if you look to 10 redefinitions, one is specifically about political systems, and exactly what you mentioned, it's mentioned there. So it is in. Yeah, it is. Just read it, the first one, because this is a kind of follow-up of the basics. And I think from that point of view, and just the final example, because I know you are getting nervous, I want to explain you how we act actually in climate talks and why we are not on a good way to finish them. Climate talks are entirely around cleaning the supply side. But if you clean the supply side, if you clean, for example, the steel industry, but you don't ask yourself a question, are we using that steel for empty cars, for empty houses? And then going to the consumption side, where it's obviously that is us in high-income countries overshooting planetary boundaries, then we don't put simply on the table the most obvious question, which is overconsumption. And do you think that we will win low-income countries in that geopolitical discussion by ignoring that? Come on. Thank you.
Thanks.
And now, as promised, Marcin, Korolec, and our panelists will get a minute each to summarize. Marcin. I won't wrap up. I'll try and respond because I was asked a question. I was put on the spot by a general question, what I would recommend. And I had the honor of being a deputy minister and for 10 years. And so it's a little difficult to provide a quick and fast answer. What I would say, what lesson we can learn, especially looking at what's been happening after 2015, is that the best decisions we implement are implemented in a negotiation and in European cooperation, and as part of a process of negotiation. And the Elżbieta Bieńkowska, I want to follow up on what Heather said about the tipping points, about the climate movement, the youth climate movement. In mid-2019, the Green Deal wasn't discussed as a concept, it was too radical, but it became part of the European vocabulary. It became a household term. So do you see any other? Is there something we might not notice? Are there any positive tipping points that might serve to accelerate this process? Well, first of all, we need to realize that the world was a different place 10 years ago in terms of the way the Green Deal was perceived, in terms of the way the environment was perceived. I didn't change my views 5 years ago, but 20 years ago. It was an evolutionary process. But so it's not the case that we can talk about what happened 10 years ago and now, especially given where we are. But even in the early days in the European Commission in 2014, it was a different conversation altogether. The youth climate movements, the youth activists made us talk about it, or inspired us to talk about it more and think about it more. Ambassador Truszczyński mentioned this. It all begins and all ends in education. Of course, there are some people who have firm beliefs and they can't be persuaded, but education is crucial in every aspect of our life. The environment, law and order, rule of law, or emissions, health, and everything. Education is paramount. And we shouldn't spare money on spending on education. I agree as regards education, but I like what you said, what the gentleman said. If we have a local problem, we can solve it locally, but if we have a global problem, we need dialogue, and we clearly need a joint approach. We need to understand other points of view. Otherwise, we won't be able to solve that problem. And here, Europe has one vote. It's an important vote, but it's also burdened. It's burdened by the European past, and that's a challenge, because I also travel a lot. I go to Asia, Africa, and they don't want to listen to Europe in those countries. And that's a question, what we want to do, so they don't treat what we're proposing as something that's exclusively in our interest. So, and I would insist that the two things I said are fundamental. We need to tackle global challenges that concern everyone, because only then will there be a willingness to talk to us and to share another perspective, because we're all in the same boat. Here, you need education, because if people don't understand that we're in the same boat, they won't join the conversation. And people and companies need to join in the process. Consumers and the market are important players. So, of course, the state can regulate and can require things, can impose things. Of course, it matters a great deal what European or US money is being spent on, but there needs to be a groundswell. People need to join in the process. Yes, to respond to the question on education and the need for education, I think that obviously, yes, we do. However, now we only have 7 years left because this decade will determine whether we succeed, whether we achieve, whether we get the change done, a change that will ensure us some fundamental security in the face of climate change. But in studying in elementary or secondary school won't give a lot, and here the media has a lot to do in terms of reaching out to the older generations and not so much the younger generation. So people are heating their houses with. It's not that people are heating their houses with coal or filthy or garbage because they hate the environment. People can't join in the just transition because they can't afford it. I recently was asked what climate-oriented handout would look like in Poland, the 500 plus program. So I think some sort of social benefits need to be provided in order to attract people, the majority of the population. A lot was said about digitalization, about transition, about moving from ownership to use. And here I have two remarks, two associations. Perhaps this is a time when we ought to consider moving to a shorter 4-day work week, or and guaranteed employment or guaranteed basic income. So that's one. And second, digitization means that many people, many employees become quote-unquote useless, redundant. And these are people who also need to be brought on board. They need to be listened to, and they need to take part in coming up with alternatives. And now, with factories being shut down or going bankrupt, coal mines and factories, so any ideas of qualifying, re-employing, or providing guarantees for employees of failing industries, we don't have that yet. Mateusz, you have 1 minute. I always have a problem when someone says that education is the answer, because I don't know if you remember your school, the hierarchy it imposes, a teacher who pontificates, who teaches. Of course, that's necessary, but when it comes to issues of climate and expertise, the educational system also needs to be circular, and also reach out and also address things that the professional managerial class aren't necessarily aligned with. Dominika mentioned a few instruments that are being discussed, a few ways of translating this economic change into something that can be implemented, that's doable in a specific region. We'll be looking at Eastern Wielkopolska, with the business partners, social partners, and local government. So we'll be looking at development cooperatives and shift the transition from general outlines, a compass that sets out the direction, to specific implementation in the field. That's what needs to be done. And this is an element. I don't want to talk about persuading people, bringing people on board. Let's not talk about leaving no one behind, but we need to be serious and do it all together. We need to be prepared to listen to people's doubts, concerns, and learn from them, and reshape, redesign our ideas to make them appealing to people's interests, values, in terms of people's interests and values. And finally, and also a self-governing, self-determination. So not just providing money, but providing a sense of agency, a sense of empowerment. That's crucial if it's not to be seen as finger wagging. Thank you. And now, with a brief, slight delay, we've come to the end of this debate, which was very intense. And for me, it was definitely very interesting. I hope that at least some of you found it to be interesting as well. So thank you for your attention. Thank you to the authors of the report for the presentation. Thank you for their participation. Thanks to our panelists, our commentators, for expanding the discussion. Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you to the interpreters. And have a good evening. And let's hope that the best case scenario will come to pass, and that the wall we're headed for that we can swerve and avoid that wall instead of crashing into it. This is a topic we will be pursuing. We will be examining further. There will